This episode is brought to you in part by the Moab Museum. Located in the heart of Red Rock landscape of southeast Utah is a cultural and natural history museum dedicated to sharing the rich stories of Moab, Utah, and the greater Canyonland region through exhibits, programs, and community events. Join the Moab Museum team this fall for The People's Tapestry, weaving tradition in Navajo culture, an exhibition that features nearly 100 textiles from the desert Southwest and contributions from the Utah Department of Arts and Museums. A traveling exhibit, Navajo Children Weaving the Future. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to Utah Stories. So we've got some big stories we are breaking this week. It's been a long time coming. We've been working on these stories for a very long time because we wanted to be able to get the facts straight. We didn't want to be having the wrong tone, be too accusatory, or misrepresenting certain established entities or politicians. But this is all about the homeless industrial complex in Utah. Does it exist? Is there, in other words, are there political leaders and people who have a vested interest in keeping the problem, exacerbating the homeless problem, exacerbating and not solving the homeless problem in Utah? Are there people getting rich off the homeless? So this all goes back to 2 years ago when I first started investigating homelessness. I found a man who wanted to remain anonymous, who was working for the county, who described this homeless industrial complex in quite a bit of detail. And I've kept this guy under wraps for a long time, and we finally decided we're going to do a Instagram reel showing what he had to say. After this guy said what he said, I thought, you know, what he is saying actually makes a lot of sense, and being a county worker and being at the ground level, he had real insight into the problem. And this gentleman had a brother who had schizophrenia who was suffering. And sometimes, you know, families are completely exhausted with the psychological disorders they're trying to deal with, and they need help from the government or another entity. And that's really common. So I want to play that clip. MJ's going to play that clip for you right now.
My little brother had schizophrenia, and I was worried about him, totally worried about him, that he was going to end up on the street, and I'm like kicking him off the trains and stuff, and he ended up committing suicide in February. You know, we have like older people who are mentally unstable that are just living on the street. We need institutions back. We need to be able to institutionalize people. The cities, they just make money off the taxpayers without trying to solve any problem. Homelessness, industrial complex, allowing people to camp and live in squalor and filth and drugs is not compassionate. It's not compassionate. Yeah.
And he's not going into details about what he's witnessed. But what we did since I recorded that clip 2 years ago is we've talked to dozens of homeless people on the streets, asking them what is there in the plethora of homeless services that is helping you the most. Is this money that we're pouring into this system, is it being accounted for? We've just asked these questions. And the answer to that is no. That money is not really being accounted for. And we've had some really fascinating guests on the program who have talked about that. So one of the first guests we had on about a year and a half ago was a guy by the name of Scott Howell. And he was in the state legislature for, I believe, like 10 or 12 years. And he said that he was appointed the position to be overlooking all of the money that was going into the homeless arena, and the grants that were being written to the federal government that were being applied to homeless shelters and homeless services, and where that money was going, how it was being spent. And he said he just had the most difficult time trying to do that job. And the way he explained it was he would get, say, $100,000 for 100 homeless people. And the NGO, which was most typically such as the road home, would say, okay, you're $100,000 for 100 people, that's fine, but now we've got 200 people, so now we need $200,000. And he said every year he was on that committee, the budget for homeless services would escalate more and more and more, and then they'd be asking, well, what have you done to alleviate the problem? And they said, well, we can't solve the problem because the problem's just getting worse. And it's outside of our control that it's getting worse. And so they could hold themselves not accountable at all for solving the problem, which kind of led to the introduction of permanent supportive housing, which is this idea of housing first. Let's get the homeless off of the streets, out of the temporary shelters. Let's get them into permanent supportive housing, and let's actually solve the problem. And that was initiated in Utah in 2005. Utah was one of the early adopters of that system, and as was San Francisco, Los Angeles, Portland, all of these very much failed places. But unlike those places, in 2015, Utah declared that we had solved homelessness. It was kind of really surprising to hear that we had solved homelessness, but they had put about 1,200 people into permanent supportive housing. Those were all the most chronically homeless people that had been on the streets for years and years. And then by 2016, we saw a flood of homeless people on the streets of downtown Salt Lake. And that was for a number of reasons. I mean, the first reason that I heard that I kind of glommed onto was in declaring that we had solved homelessness, we attracted all of the other cities that were struggling with homelessness to send all of their homeless people to Salt Lake City using one-way bus tickets from like Las Vegas. And that's probably part of it, but at the same time we had the opioid epidemic. A lot of people were the families were exhausted in trying to handle their addiction problems, mental illness. And anyway, and by 2016 our streets were flooded with homeless people. And then we had a major problem on our hands, and the state issued a new operation called Operation Rio Grande, where $68 million was allocated to try to solve the crisis we found ourselves in with homelessness. Long story short, more and more and more and more money has flowed into the homeless sector of our support services and Health and Human Services Department. And we've written this article that really summarizes where this money is going to the best of our ability. One of the people who is now at the head of the Homeless Services Committee is Wayne Niederhauser, and he was earning $40,000 a year as a state legislator. He was a Senate state president. Once he appointed himself to be the homeless czar, the state homeless coordinator, he started earning $250,000 a year. So what does Wayne Niederhauser do? He is supposed to come up with the solutions to the problem, and he is he's trying to allocate more and more money to affordable housing. But why would Wayne Niederhauser, the Senate state president, this guy, be so qualified to determine where affordable housing should be built? That's my question. And because he's got a developer background. He's one of Utah's, I used to call him developosauruses. We have all of our political leaders are developers/politicians. And he's like the chief developosaurus. He develops property. He's got a big CW management company, tons of property, and they make him the state homeless coordinator. And I would assume a big part of what he gets to do is decide who gets this money for affordable housing, and he can pad the pockets of all his friends who are developers too. I mean, I wouldn't assume he could do that, but I haven't been able to speak to him. Maybe he's got only the best of intentions and the kindest of hearts, but we've asked him now 4 or 5 times to just come on the program. You know Scott Howell, he came on the program. You know Sim Gill, he's been on the program. Why not come on the program, Wayne Niederhauser, and answer our questions? Because the question I would ask him is, why are you at the helm of the State Homeless Services Committee, and why what is it you're doing? What is your job? and I'm sure he'd answer the questions and probably be great. But I would just like to know what's going on, and so read the entire article. I'm not going to go over the whole thing. But the problem is that the highly paid administrators, they don't answer to taxpayers. These are administrators. This is Utah's deep state. And that you can get paid, go from earning $44,000 a year to earning $250,000 a year by getting an appointment. I mean, this is under Spencer Cox, so definitely Governor Cox had something to do with his appointment. But to earn so much money being the homeless service coordinator, I would just like to know what is it you're doing. And I know he's doing stuff because Scott Howell, James Buchanan, they said he's doing stuff. I just like to know what. And so anyway, State Office of Homeless Services received $55 million in ARPA funds. Their budget is $210 million, up from just $56 million 2 years ago. Why did they get a fourfold increase of funding in 2 years? Where is that money going? This chart here, I'm going to show it on my screen, is a chart that just came out about a week ago. And here you can see our whole state budget. It's kind of cool. All these little circles represent different budget items. You have integrated health. You have basic school program. The one that relates to homelessness the most is Office of Homeless Services. Okay, here we go, finally. So $210 million is appropriated. The base bill, $500,000 goes out. I guess that was for the previous year. But I mean, this is trying to follow the money. This is what we do. And Wayne Niederhauser could probably explain all this because this is his office getting this funding. And it relates to all of these House bills that have been passed. And all this money is going to such as housing, a project-based income intervention to enhance housing revenue streams sufficient to sustain housing costs and provide services not paid for by Medicaid. Would generate 1,400 units statewide. So did that $20 million, that's one of the biggest line items on here, did that all get spent to help people afford housing? And how did that get allocated? How do people qualify for that? It sounds like a great idea. $20 million one-time funding. So we have on here another big line item. This one's actually the biggest. $30 million, a project-based income intervention to enhance housing revenue streams sufficient to sustain housing costs and provide services not paid for by Medicaid. That's the same language as this one. So I guess those, even though they're doing the same thing, that's actually $50 million. So who gets this money? I'm sure Wayne Niederhauser could answer that question. I could assume that it's all on the up and up. It's all going to great causes. But when I talk to people on the streets, I just don't see that happening. When I talk to people on the streets, I find out, oh, yeah, I couldn't afford one gentleman I talked to that was in the island, freezing cold in the right before the All-Star game, said, well, I got my family had to move. I wanted to stay. I couldn't afford my rent. I got kicked out of my apartment, and now I'm on the streets because I have nowhere else to go. He would be a perfect candidate for some of that funding to help him with rent relief. But then when you go to the page allocated for rent relief, it says we're not taking applications anymore. So did all of that $50 million get spent? Where did that money go? I would love to look into it. I'd love to report on, maybe they're doing a great job and it's all been allocated and it helped people get off the streets. But when I talk to homeless people, I hear, I didn't get any of that money. I didn't know about that money. I don't know how I get qualified for it. Or when I talk to them about Housing First, permanent supportive housing, they'll say, well, I'm not disabled enough. I haven't been chronically homeless enough. I got to be out here at least another 6 months before I'll even get on the list. And as we learned, the way that permanent supportive housing works, it's on a point system. And the more chronically homeless, drug addicted, mentally ill you are, the more points you get, the more chances you have of getting into housing. Which now brings me to which is a great segue into our other story, which is about the Magnolia Apartments. We broke this story over a year ago that an inside source tells us that the $16.4 million Magnolia Apartments have turned into a drug-infested den and cesspool of criminal activity. The Magnolia Apartments, if you didn't know, are these beautiful apartments. They're designed to take the chronically homeless people, the ones I just described, who got enough points to get off the streets into permanent supportive housing, and put them in this nice apartment with quartz countertops and kitchen and, beautiful place. But it was supposed to provide wraparound services so all these people could get off the drugs, stop the criminal behavior, and really lead productive lives. But that's not happening. It's turned into a terrible place for lots of people using lots of drugs. And according to the manager, an anonymous person who is staying there every day, and a tenant, they tell me since September 2022, 12 people have died there of drug overdoses and other deaths. I tried to verify that with the police department. We're going back and forth. The Salt Lake City Police Department, records department, stopped communicating with me. Now we are talking again since we broke this story. Really happy about that. But who's died, how they died, I don't know. I'm trying to get those records. We're trying to get more information about that. It's really difficult because according to Salt Lake City Police Department, they don't track all the details and they don't track a person's housing status. And so I really want to start an initiative to understand more how people are dying. Because you saw in that previous clip I played that gentleman's brother committed suicide on the streets. He was living on the streets and then he killed himself. I find from people we interview in the park all the time, MJ can attest to this, we hear about people committing suicide all the time in the park. Somebody hung themselves like 2 weeks ago when we were out there. Somebody slit their own throat. And it's like a horrible environment for so many people. And what is being done about it? I don't think there's enough compassion. I don't think there's enough understanding of the situation. Going from the comments we're getting on Instagram, it's like people are either saying, yeah, we need to do more for the homeless, or, yeah, stick it to all those stupid bums. They should all die. And it's like people aren't trying to understand the nuance of the situation. Yeah, a lot of homeless people are addicted. Yeah, a lot of homeless people are alcoholics. But a lot of them are mentally ill, where if they could get the right treatment or they could get into a mental hospital, they could recover. They could be doing a whole lot better. And I